Good afternoon and welcome to the Grant Professional Association's webinar titled Grants as Part of Your Capital Campaign. My name is Kelly Romero and I am the Membership Director for the Grant Professionals Association, and I am your webinar moderator for today. You are all placed in listen-only mode, which means that your line is muted. If you would like to ask a question, please feel free to use the chat box on your screen to submit any of your questions. We will get to them as time permits throughout the webinar. And at the end of the webinar, you will be directed to a brief survey. We ask that you please fill it out to assist us with any of our future webinars. Today's presenters are Linda Lizakowski, ACFRE, and Susan Schaefer, CFRE. Linda is one of approximately 100 professionals worldwide to hold the Advanced Certified Fundraising Executive designation. In her 19 years as a philanthropic consultant, she has managed capital campaigns, helped dozens of nonprofit organizations achieve their development goals, and trained more than 22,000 professionals in all aspects of development. Linda is an AFP certified master trainer and serves on the board of the AFP Foundation for Philanthropy. Susan Schaefer is a consultant, writer, and speaker who is passionate about the nonprofit sector. Her practical approach has made her a frequent presenter at conferences and in classrooms. She founded Resource Partners, LLC in 2001 with a mission to help nonprofits excel at fundraising and board development. Susan co-edited the Nonprofit Consulting Playbook, Winning Strategies from 25 Leaders in the Field, with Linda Lizakowski. She is currently co-authoring a book about serving on a nonprofit board. Susan and Linda, thank you for taking the time to present this wonderful webinar, and please dial *7 to unmute your line and begin your presentation.
Okay, I hope everyone can hear me. I think that was *7, right?
Yes.
Okay, good, so you can hear me.
Yes.
Okay. Well, thank you everyone for joining us today, and I'm really delighted to be here with Susan. We have become fast friends ever since we co-edited our consulting playbook and have done a number of presentations together. So the way we're going to do today's presentation, sometimes we kind of go back and forth, but today, since Susan is really much more of a grant expert than I am, and I'm more of a capital campaign expert than she, so I'm going to talk a little bit about capital campaigns in general and how they work, and then turn it over to Susan to talk about the role of grants in a capital campaign. We're assuming that most of you are grant writers, and some of you probably have been involved in capital campaigns. Maybe some of you, this is all new, so that's why we want to talk a little bit about what is a capital campaign, because someday someone in your office may come to you and say, hey, we're doing this capital campaign, and we need to raise X number of dollars from grants for this campaign. So we think that it's going to be really to your benefit to understand the whole concepts behind capital campaigns. And sometimes people kind of think that they're a little mysterious and maybe they're a little bit like rocket science, but basically they're not much different from much of the annual fundraising that your organization does. There are some differences that we'll talk about. And I think one of the things that is really important to consider is some organizations, and I know I've worked with groups that said, well, we need to raise money for some capital expenses, so we'll just find who gives capital grants. And what I have found in my experience, and maybe Susan will add shed some light on this when she talks, that many times foundations will look at your capital campaign request and say, yes, we'll fund this portion of it, but we want you to also go out and raise money from your community, so that it's not just a foundation thing, it's really a community-wide thing. So that's why we decided to talk about this topic of what is a capital campaign and then how the grant process fits into it. So a capital campaign is basically defined as a significant fundraising, and it's usually for major institutional needs such as buildings, which is often thought about most when you think of a capital campaign. Are you building a new building, renovating a building, possibly upgrading things like ADA requirements and technology and things like that. But oftentimes capital campaigns are run for other things as well, such as an endowment campaign, which operates very similar to a capital campaign, except that you're looking for money to endow the building going forward. And one of the pieces of advice that I always give any of my clients who are looking at doing a capital campaign is to make sure that you do put some money in there for endowment, because most of the time when you are building a new building, your operating expenses usually are going to increase. Now, I've had some experiences where people's operating expenses actually decreased because they were paying such high rent in the location that they were at that owning their own building ended up saving them money. But in most cases, you're building a new building because you want to add more programs, you need to serve more people, you might need, a better facility. So in most cases, you might find that to add these programs and things, you're going to need some endowment in there. And the worst thing you want to do is build a great, fantastic new building and then not have the money to operate it. And I've seen some people do that. So that's why I usually suggest that you put some money into this campaign for endowment and maybe even for program. And what I found is that adding some money into this for program opens up some avenues in grant funding that may not be available to you otherwise, because there are some foundations that will not fund buildings or endowment, but they might fund a program. So oftentimes we do what's known as a comprehensive campaign, where you're raising money for a new building. Maybe you're also adding some money in there for endowment, and maybe you're also adding your annual fund in there to fund some of your ongoing programs. And many organizations find that a comprehensive campaign makes a lot of sense for their organization, because this way they can raise enough money and they don't have to worry about a loss in their annual fund while they're conducting the capital campaign, because sometimes you do see a drop in your annual giving because of your emphasis on the capital campaign. So what's involved in a capital campaign and what makes it, a little bit different and in some ways very close to what you're doing in other annual fundraising? Well, the things that are involved in a capital campaign typically are doing some sound research. And there's several ways of doing research for several different purposes. One is you want to make sure, if you are looking at putting up a new building, that you've done the research to find out whether or not you really need a new building. Some organizations get very attracted, and we often hear board members say, well, let's run a capital campaign. That's a great way to raise a lot of money, and we can raise money, real fast by doing a capital campaign. But if your community doesn't see the need for a new building or for an endowment or for whatever it is that you're raising this money for, you are probably going to not be very successful in it. So you want to do some research to find out, first of all, do you really need to do a capital campaign? There are some organizations that just have it in their head that they have to own a building. And for some organizations, it might not make sense to own a building. It might make more sense for you to just stay in rented office space or loaned office space or wherever you're currently operating. So you want to do that research. But then you also need to obviously research your donors. Do you have enough donors that are going to be able to support this campaign? So this is where those of you involved in the grant area are really going to excel, because you're very accustomed to doing research. Long-range planning is also important. When someone wants to contribute to a major capital campaign, it may be the largest gift they've ever given your organization. So they want to see that you have a good sense of direction. Is this a program that's needed in your community? Why are you doing this? And what are your plans to fund the building once it's built? Because a lot of funders are going to ask you, how are you going to pay for this building once we give you the money to build it? So that's important. Persuasive campaign literature is one of the really tricky parts of a capital campaign, because, yes, campaign literature is important, but you should never let that become such a big focus that you forget about other things like the research and the long-range planning. I've worked with some clients who, in fact, one in particular that I worked with, had this great idea to build a new private school, and they had the land already donated, and they were going to be going into a planning study, which I'll talk about in a few minutes, to see if the community would support this project. But at the same time, they were working with us as fundraising consultants. They were also working with a marketing company who said to them, oh, you need to do a video and you need to do all of this. And they started spending a lot of time, effort, and a lot of money to develop some great-looking material, but they didn't want to spend the time on researching their donors, and basically they didn't even want to ask their donors. They just thought having all this great marketing material, people would just start throwing money at them, and it doesn't quite work that way. So it's important to look at your organization and decide what kind of campaign literature you want. Do you need a video? Do you need DVDs? Do you need a PowerPoint? Do you need a fancy brochure? Some organizations, yes, they probably do need that, but I have also found that if an organization spends too much money on all the marketing materials, sometimes funders will say, well, we'd rather fund, the program, or we want to see the building built. We don't want to fund all this fancy material that you're putting together. So that's a very fine line that you have to walk with a capital campaign. Effective organization is totally critical. You really need to have a well-organized campaign, and I'm going to talk about that in a few minutes. You also need to follow some proven procedures. Capital campaigns are different in some ways than other fundraising, but one of the things that I find fascinating is that the proven procedures that take place in a capital campaign will also help you in your annual giving. And just as an example, some of these proven procedures that I'm talking about hold true no matter how much money you're trying to raise, no matter where you're located, and no matter what type of organization you have. And one of those proven truisms of fundraising for campaigns is that you always start from the inside out and from the top down, which means that you start by raising money from your board, your staff, the people who are really closest to your organization, working from the inside out before you go out and start talking to the community at large. And working from the top down means that you look at those major donors first. Where are you going to get the big chunk of money that you're going to need to run this campaign? And typically, you're looking for a lead gift of at least 10% of the overall goal. So those are some proven procedures that will help you not only in a capital campaign, but also with your annual giving. Careful scheduling and publicity are critical. You don't want to ever launch a campaign publicly before you've raised at least 60 to 80% of your goal, because otherwise the general public sees that, gosh, they're not going to make that goal, so I'm not going to support it. The two things that really make a campaign, I think, very different from other fundraising that you're doing is the tight timeline you have. A campaign is run in a very specified time period, and I have seen a lot of organizations running what I kind of call the perpetual campaign, where they started a capital campaign and it wasn't very successful, and 10 years later they're still running that campaign, and believe me, the community gets very sick of it. So you want to make sure that you have a very tight timeline, but allow yourself enough time to get all those major gift asks and everything else done. And you also need a prescribed budget. Is how much is it going to cost? Because running a capital campaign does cost you money. You'll almost certainly be hiring a consultant. You'll need those campaign materials. You need maybe some travel expenses and things like that. So you want to make sure that you have a budget laid out to make sure this is going to fit into your organization's plans. You also need a very solid infrastructure before you start running a capital campaign, and hopefully your organization has all these things in place already, such as ethical standards. I think that's absolutely essential. A good donor software package. For some organizations that have never done a capital campaign, they may never have had to, for example, record a pledge, because all of their money comes in a grant that's automatically given to them, or a donation that comes in through the mail, or a special event that generates funds. So they may have never had to record a multi-year pledge. And in capital campaigns, you're almost always going to be working with a 3 to a 5, or sometimes even longer if it's a big campaign. But you want to make sure that I think it's really critical that you have that donor software in place before you start a campaign, because I've had one client that purchased software and really didn't use it the way that it should have been used, and they ended up getting unfulfilled pledges because they were not sending out pledge reminders to people. An annual giving history is important. It's not one of the most important things. I have run many capital campaigns with organizations that had no annual giving history, but they had all of the other things in place. And I'm going to talk about the key components that you need to have in place in a minute. But an annual giving history is the best place to start. Your current donors in your annual giving are probably going to be your major donors for a capital campaign. So the stronger your annual giving history is, the more likely you'll be able to do a campaign in less time and with more success. You also need to have gift acceptance policies in place, and of course, these should be in place for all of your fundraising, but they're especially critical in a capital campaign. And I could tell you probably dozens of stories about organizations that didn't have those policies in place, but one of the organizations that did have a set of policies in place saved themselves a lot of time and aggravation, because when they were doing their study, someone offered them a piece of land, and in this community, land was selling for about $1.5 million an acre. So they were delighted when somebody offered them a piece of land. But then their policy was that any kind of gifts of land needed due diligence first. And when they did their due diligence, they found that the soil needed remediation that was going to cost them $500,000. And they didn't have that in their budget, so they turned down that piece of land. So those things are important. Staff support. A campaign is going to take a lot of time away from your normal activities. And if you don't have enough staff to run a campaign, you may need to bring on a part-time staff person, or at least a temporary staff person, to help you with the campaign. Even if you're working with a consultant, there are a lot of staff roles that are going to take a lot of time away from your normal day-to-day routine. And if you have a one-person shop and they're trying to write your ongoing grants and run your events and do your annual fundraising and everything else, and at the same time run a capital campaign, things are going to be stretched and something's going to suffer. So make sure you have enough staff support. And then a critical thing is approval of regulatory authorities. Most communities do require, most states, and in the United States at least, do require that you're registered to do fundraising before you go out and solicit funds. So if you're going to be soliciting funds in other than your own state, you need to make sure that you have the approval of those regulatory authorities. And in addition to state registration, there are things to be concerned about, like, does your local community have a capital campaign review board that has to approve campaigns? Are you part of a national organization? Has your board given the appropriate approval to do this campaign? So all of those things are important for you to think about. And I know that I'm really throwing an awful lot of information at you that probably by this point you're thinking, oh my gosh, I don't want to run a capital campaign. But I think the important things to remember are some of the key issues that I consider the real pillars of success. And like I said, all of those things that I previously discussed, like, you know, getting donor software, getting approval of the regulatory authorities, those are all things that can be done relatively simple if you have the right help in doing those. But a couple things that are really, really critical, and I think these are the four most important things that make a campaign successful, are board commitment. Is your board 100% committed to doing this campaign? Do you have a compelling case for support? And the way you test that is going to be through your planning study, which I'm going to talk about in a few minutes. Do you have prospective donors? Are there people who would support this campaign? And again, those annual giving donors are probably going to be the most likely donors. But if you don't have a strong annual giving program, then how are you going to find those prospective donors? It may take a lot more research, a lot more cultivation before donors are ready to support a major effort like a capital campaign. And to me, the most important part of this is effective volunteer leadership. I have seen a lot of campaigns that didn't have any of these things in place. They didn't have an annual giving program. They didn't have the registration completed. They didn't have their gift acceptance policies, and those can all be developed as you go along. But some of the campaigns I've worked with have been successful, even despite a lot of things that you would think would be against them, because they had the right volunteer leadership. They had key community leaders who were ready to step up and get involved in this campaign, and it made all the difference in the world. So that effective leadership is really an important part of your process. So just to kind of reiterate some of the things that we talked a little bit about, some things that should be in your gift acceptance policies are what type of gifts you will accept. Do you want a gift of land? Do you want a gift of gifts in kind? And I've seen some capital campaigns that have raised a third of their goal in gifts in kind, getting everything from the land, the excavation, the paving of the driveway, the furniture inside the building, and those kind of things can be really helpful. But you don't want to take gifts that you don't need, like outdated computers that really aren't going to be any use to you at all, and then you have to pay to haul them away yet. So it's really important to you to think about what type of gifts you're going to accept. Who are you going to accept gifts from? There may be some people in your community that you don't want to accept gifts from. I happen to live in the state of Nevada, where in most of the counties in this state, the smaller counties, brothels are a legal business, and I've had a lot of clients have to deal with, do we take a gift from a brothel? It's a legal business. They're not doing anything wrong, so you won't run into that unless you live in the state of Nevada. But you could run into some things like, if you're the lung association, do you take gifts from the tobacco industry? Those are questions that you and your board need to answer. And how are you going to dispose of gifts if they're not things that you can directly use for this campaign? So if someone gives you a gift of stock, you probably are going to need to convert that into cash if you want it for a capital campaign. If it's something that's going into an endowment, maybe you can leave it there, but then you need to have someone manage your investment portfolio. So all of those things are really critical for all of your fundraising, but especially in a capital campaign. Board responsibilities are another big issue, especially in capital campaigns, because this is something where you're going to be going to some major foundations and major donors and major corporations in your community and asking them to give. And one of the things they're going to ask is, what's the level of support from your board? So ideally, you have some people on your board who have the capability. We often talk about affluence and influence, and capability means that you have all board members, no matter how affluent they are willing to give at a meaningful level for them. And the capital campaign is a perfect time to get your board to thinking about making a stretch gift and making a commitment that is really significant for them and significant in your campaign. And that doesn't mean that all your board members need to be wealthy. I worked with a group of volunteer firefighters once who had 33 people on their board. None of them were wealthy. They were basically, kind of blue-collar workers who volunteered to go out and fight fires in their spare time. But because they had 33 of them, I said, if you each only gave $100 a year for the 3 years of this campaign, you'll be raising $10,000, and that is significant in light of the board that you have in place. And they were able to do that, and it convinced people that, yes, they were behind this 100%. Also, your board should have some access to potential donors, and sometimes we ignore that, and we think, oh, well, we don't have a board of movers and shakers, so we can't access major donors. But your board members may still have influence. They may be able to get out and promote your campaign in their Rotary Club, their church groups, their, whatever organizations they belong to. Maybe they're companies. Maybe they're not at a real high level in their company, but their company could be a major donor. They might have contacts with foundations that you don't know about. So really work with your board to find out who they know, what their level of affluence and influence is, and no matter what level that is, your board should all be willing to work on this campaign, to get involved. Maybe some of them obviously should be serving as campaign leaders, but every board member should be involved somehow in this campaign, whether it's helping identify donors, cultivate donors, go out and solicit donors, whatever it is that they can do. Every board member should be willing to get involved in some level. Staff responsibilities, I did mention how much time a campaign takes, and I just wanted to give you some idea of some of the things that happen in a capital campaign that you may not be accustomed to if you've never done one. And one is that because you're working with a lot of volunteers, there's going to be maybe monthly meetings of the campaign cabinet, maybe quarterly meetings depending on the size and scope of your campaign. But there's going to be meetings and events that have to be coordinated. There's going to be reports that need to be prepared for the board, for the CEO, for the campaign cabinet. And because using volunteers is so important, you need to have the staff that can support those volunteers, because I've worked on dozens of campaigns, and I can guarantee that some volunteer is going to call you one day and say, oh gosh, I'm supposed to go out and meet with so-and-so to ask them for their gift today, but I lost that case for support you gave me. I think it accidentally, my dog ate it, or the same excuses that your kids use for their homework are the things you're going to hear with volunteers. So you need to have staff that is willing to support those volunteers and say, oh, that's okay, I'll meet you at the restaurant and give you another case for support or whatever. So make sure that you have someone who can support those volunteers. You also want to have good internal communications. The worst thing that can happen from the public perspective in a campaign is that sometimes you have someone call and say, oh, I have a question about the capital campaign, and the people inside your organization say, what? What are you talking about? What's a capital campaign? So you need to internally communicate and externally communicate with all your stakeholders about this campaign. You obviously are going to need someone to prepare grant proposals, and then just a lot of clerical support. So all of those things are really critical in your campaigning. So you want to make sure that you have a staff that can handle all those things. And as I said, the volunteers, to me, are the most critical aspect of your campaign. You'll need a campaign cabinet, which could be, depending on the campaign, anywhere from 15 to 30 people. You'll need different committees. Most of those are going to be involved in direct solicitations, like leadership gifts, major gifts, a small business division. You might have an alumni division if you're a school. You might have regional divisions if you're a national organization. And then you'll need some committee members who maybe aren't involved in direct solicitation, but they're going to be doing things like running events, and I don't mean fundraising events, but kickoff events, dedication, open house, recognition, groundbreaking, those type of things. You might also need a public relations committee unless you have a strong PR department within your organization. The same with the finance and a building committee. If you don't have a strong finance committee on your board, you might want to have one just for this campaign. And then you might need a building committee just to help with things like getting licenses and hiring architects and all of those things that take place. So all of this is really an important part of your campaign. And I want to end up by talking a little bit about how most people start a campaign is doing a planning study or a feasibility study, which is where you engage an outside consultant to come in and survey your stakeholders and try to help kind of pre-sell this campaign to the really major donor prospects, like major foundations in your community, major corporations, your major leadership gift donors. And the study really helps you sell the campaign to the right people. It's not a public announcement yet of your campaign, but it gets you in the door with the people that really count. And it helps you strengthen relationships with your donors because they feel really important if you're asking their input, and that's what you're doing at this stage. You're not asking for their money, but you're asking for their advice. And even if these people have never given to your organization before, it helps kind of win some new friends for your case and it helps raise the site. Sometimes people think they can go out and raise, $10 million by asking 100 people for $100,000 or whatever, and it never works that way. You need to have those lead gifts. So doing a study will help prepare people for the fact that you need some big gifts, and then you need a lot of smaller gifts and a whole lot of really small gifts. So that's kind of a basic, in a nutshell, role of the campaign and what's involved. Before I turn it over to Susan, I think I did see one question that said how much should be raised before going public, and I recommend usually 60 to 80%, because the reason is if you only have 10 or 20% raised, people are going to say, oh gosh, they're never going to make that goal. So it is important that you time your public kickoff based on, they used to say 50%, but I find that campaigns are getting larger and larger, and they're dependent much more on major gifts. That 95-5 rule, that 95% of your gifts in a campaign typically come from 5% of your donors. So you want to make sure those lead gifts are in hand first before you go out. Now, you can be working on grants, doing your research and things like that, but I wouldn't announce it publicly to the general public until you have 60 to 80%. So, Susan, I'm going to turn it over to you and let you take it from here.
Terrific. Thanks, Linda. And I have to say, that was a phenomenal overview of campaigns in 25 minutes.
I know. I'm trying to sum up a 3-hour.
That was great. It's a very complex subject. And it's worth noting that as Linda was talking, for those of you on the line who have not been involved with a campaign before, I could hear you possibly thinking, boy, these are some tremendous details, but what do these details have to do with the grants piece of a campaign? And I would say that not only did Linda just illustrate best practices for a capital campaign, but she also illustrated all of the elements that are really required for your grants piece of a capital campaign, because the main way in which grants differ during campaigns than they do during the non-campaign periods of your fundraising comes in the way you're describing the effort to a donor. And I would say that probably 75% of the elements Linda just mentioned become critical pieces of the case for support and the message that you are conveying to your prospects. So from things like the volunteer structure to your board involvement to your gift tracking to your case for support, if you have those pieces in place and they are solidly working or being built, then you have a stronger case for your funders. And if you just come at a capital campaign with really the same old to your funders, with maybe the exception of letting them know that you're looking to buy a building or you're looking to build an endowment, then their faith in your campaign effort will not be as strong. It's worth starting out this piece of the webinar by saying that capital campaign grants are highly competitive. As all of you know, I'm sure, grants in general are just increasingly competitive. And more funders who provide grants are not funding capital campaigns. So it really is incumbent upon all of us to use best practices, because let's face it, grants are very time-consuming, grant proposals, and it takes a lot of time out of our day. So you really do want to ensure that you have all of these pieces in place. Now, once you are developing these pieces, and I want to make sure first that I do answer the second piece of the question that had been posed, which was that how far do you go with grant seeking before going public? I think that grants are a critical piece of all of the lead gifts that Linda was talking about before you go public. So you would seek out your largest foundation or corporate or other grant makers first. So they would be part of that quiet phase of the campaign where you are amassing your other lead donors. as you can see, one of the main roles of grants in a campaign can be a lead gift. Let's be candid. Most gifts for campaigns are spearheaded by individuals, but many can also be come from foundations or sometimes even the corporate world. And this will be obvious to you because a capital campaign funder is typically not going to come out from under a rock to fund your capital campaign. It will typically be an organization that has funded yours for quite some time. So those are the groups that you would go to for a lead gift in a campaign. A challenge grant is a terrific place to plug in a foundation that has been involved with your organization and watched it grow, maybe does not have the resources to be a lead giver, but is very involved in your community. And again, if you have not been involved in a capital campaign before or a challenge gift, these tend to be the type where there are specific parameters around the gift that encourage others to come. And as opposed to a lead gift, which would be solicited early on in the campaign, a challenge grant would also often be solicited toward the middle, right before the campaign becomes public, because what they're best at doing is encouraging many smaller donors to come on board. So this is a way where you might say, for every new donor that comes on board, this say foundation will match gifts on a one-to-one basis. Construction costs are obviously a terrific place to plug in a funder of grants, but you have to be very careful these days. There are not as many organizations that fund the construction costs as there used to be, so read the guidelines very well. There are fewer that will fund land purchases, but they are out there. And I would say under that umbrella, you can also find grants of equipment, furnishing sometimes, and other material or kind of hard purchases that you need. Many times organizations would fund programs as well. So look for organizations that fund capital campaigns as well as programs. And that's where a huge portion of grants come into play with campaigns, is still around programs. Endowment is admittedly an area where many organizations assume they can turn quickly to foundations for capital funding, but this is especially an area that is really gone out of favor increasingly. So Linda provided a few warnings about going the endowment route. It's always a good idea to make sure that your organization understands exactly what an endowment will do for it before it goes down this path. There are many misconceptions about endowment funds and how they work in general to lift up an organization. We don't have time to get into all of them now, but in short, it's worth saying make sure that your executives, your board members, and everyone else understands the difference between an endowment fund and a cash reserve before they go down this route for a campaign. Because truly, in the grants realm at least, there are very few funders left who will provide endowment funds. So it's important for everyone to understand the realities of endowments before they go down that path, and make sure you do have groups that are not necessarily grant-making organizations that will be interested in supporting endowment. How will you know that? Again, I'd go back to Linda's comments about feasibility studies and ask some questions in that phase. Supporting gifts, of course, are another big piece, and what do I mean by that? It's really the corollary to a lead gift. So if you have some organizations that have been providing annual giving to your organization via grants, then supporting gifts are something above and beyond an annual gift that may not rise to the level of a lead gift where you can look for support. It's worth saying that capital grants represent about a little under a quarter of all funds awarded to nonprofits. And so there is a huge market for them out there. But again, as many of you have seen, the landscape for grants is quickly changing toward a competition-based environment where you see these innovation awards and whatnot, and you see a lot of groups looking for kind of measures of success, which sometimes falls outside of a campaign mode. So do a lot of research. This was another of Linda's very good points. Do a lot of research before you can assume that all of your current grant-making organizations will support your campaign, and do a lot of research outside of that for prospects, because there are a few that will give to capital campaigns, but many of the biggest players, the Kresge Foundation among them, who gave to campaigns for years, they have simply moved on. So you will be relying on many of your loyal grant-making funders to continue to give above and beyond to support your campaign. Okay, so the kinds of things that you need to ensure you have in place before you write your first proposal. And again, these are many of the things that Linda mentioned. The case statement is really key. And if you have not worked with them before, it is a very concise, powerful statement of what your campaign plans to achieve. And as with most communications materials these days, it should not be focused simply on what this building will look like or what it will even do for the community, but it goes beyond that to be a very powerful statement of why our organization is doing what it does, and even the corollary, what would happen if we weren't doing what we were to be doing. And that case statement becomes something that's infused into every proposal you write. So as your organization is ramping up and doing all the things that Linda talked about, your job may be helping to prime the pump with this case statement and working on some drafts that can be shown to donors and getting feedback, because really a lot of campaigns do revolve around this case statement. It's something that you end up giving to all of your volunteers, all of your grant-making organizations, and it becomes the unifying message. Board giving, as Linda mentioned, is critical, and as we all know, whether it's campaigns or not, foundations particularly want to know the percentage of your board members who have made gifts, and campaigns are no different. As a matter of fact, foundations are more interested in board giving at a time of capital fundraising. So ensure that there's 100% giving. Even better if you can show funders statistics that show that your board was giving at 100% previously, but the giving has increased X percentage during this capital campaign period. It's a terrific type of statistic to use, but you do have to have the groundwork laid in advance because it takes time to get all those board members on board, as it were. The lead gift is also very critical. You really want to be able to show a narrative to your potential grant funders. You want them to know that there is at least one, maybe more than one, entity or individual who is looking to spearhead this project. And the narrative becomes, and we'll talk about this more in a minute, the narrative becomes all of the gifts that follow. So if you have a grant-making organization that is one of your very top givers, and you can talk about another lead gift that's been solidified, then terrific. You've maybe bought in your number 2 gift. But all along the way, as you start drilling down into those smaller and smaller grants that you're seeking, you want to be able to tell a story about how these top couple of groups have come on, and then you see the momentum and more groups are coming in. So starting out with the story of that lead gift is really tremendous, and you can infuse your proposals even with some quotations from that lead giver, testimonials, pieces that show that person or organization's confidence in your project. Focused research, of course, is always a key piece to this. We talked about that a bit. It is worth talking. Not every grant-making organization will agree to be a part of your feasibility study, but it is worth asking, because when you can get a funder to agree to be part of that process, it sheds some tremendous light on the potential for your capital campaign. And even if that organization does not agree to do it, it's often logistical. They don't have the resources to sit down and spend a couple of hours with each grantee that's going through a campaign. Sometimes you can just get some good informal feedback, and that can be some of your most valuable research, whether or not you're even sitting with a database or that sort of more formal research. Asking around, asking some peer organizations what they have done. If you're looking to build a building, you can often walk inside a peer organization and look at a donor wall that was assembled during a capital campaign and just eyeball some of the funders that are there. There are some organizations that don't publicize the fact that they give to capital campaigns that do it for loyal grantees of theirs. So there are many types of research to do. Much of it is not always focused on the types of grants databases that we're used to dealing with. And a clear request is certainly important. As you know, it always is in grant seeking, but even more so now. You have to really paint a picture of what it is you're asking for, because you are in most cases asking a grant-making organization to go above and beyond. So make sure that you talk about this in terms of the community in which these grants will be useful. Finally, and we'll talk about this more in just a minute, but the relationship your organization has with a consultant. Like it or not, campaigns are often driven by a third party because, as you can see, there are just so many moving parts. And it is a comfort often to an organization that's thinking about making a large grant that there's someone who knows what they're doing, putting all of these pieces together and helping them move the process along. Because there's nothing that often spells disaster for a campaign more than one that lingers too long. So the pace is very important. Quickly, the rationale for this campaign piece is often spelled out a bit in the case statement, but outside of that, it's really important, and this does differ to some degree from non-campaign grants. It's focused on longevity, and you want to constantly be tying your work to what this project means for the future of your community, the future of the campaign generally, and the future of your organization. So those are 3 levels, but you really want to take it beyond the point you normally would in an annual type of proposal, and ensure that your grant maker, if your grant maker serves the greater Cleveland area, then make sure you speak to the fact that this campaign will serve the greater Cleveland area in this particular way in the long term. That's really what gets donors jazzed about campaigns, that long-term visioning. And that is really where you want to spend a lot of your time outside of the case statement, because the campaign will get at why your organization exists. And then this piece of it is kind of an underpinning where you talk about the fact that this particular project is going to really give momentum to some work or some trend or some innovation in your local area. And with that, when you have secured a grant, and we'll be optimistic that you will secure many, that narrative that I spoke about a minute ago becomes really critical that you continue it. And this is very difficult to do well because campaigns can be so overwhelming. But I would argue that whether an organization has already agreed to fund yours or whether they're still deciding, even when they have rejected you, I think it's really critical to have a continuing narrative that allows for an update continuously about other lead gifts that you've bought in, other grants that you've secured, even if they're more in the mid-range. Any updates on your board support? Maybe you weren't quite at 100% when you went to a foundation, although you really should be before you go. But I know it's not always possible, or maybe you had an extraordinary board gift that came in the interim period. Maybe you've had board members who have given a second or third time. Any other sort of campaign progress. You've broken ground on your building. You've secured some innovative type of equipment for the building as it's going up. Any sort of news could just be briefly summarized and sent out in very brief format. It could become an email. It could be in hard copy. But ideally it would be a little bit personalized so that you let funders know that you're still really invested in them. Let's face it, campaigns go on for such a long time that you can often secure multiple gifts from grant makers as the campaign goes on. So all of these pieces only build confidence. And it's worth mentioning too that naming opportunities can be a part of these strategies. So as you all know, some donors on the grants side are more interested in that than others, but you want to make sure you spell that out for those who are interested, because the more they read about the fact that you've got all of these pieces in place and that the momentum is going in your favor, the more they may be interested, for instance, in increasing or providing a second grant so that they may qualify for an upgraded naming opportunity. Okay, so I'm going to turn it over to Linda for a minute to talk about the role of consultants in the campaign. As she mentioned, she focuses a bit more on the campaign piece, and then I'll follow up to talk about the grants side of that. So Linda?
Okay, great. Well, I think one of the things that's important to remember about, I mentioned earlier that most organizations that are running a capital campaign do work with fundraising counsel, but that role has changed so much in the years since I've been in consulting. And years ago, and still today, I guess some organizations have what's called resident counsel, where a fundraising consultant will come in and really actually live at your organization. Maybe they'll come from out of town or across the country and stay in your community for months at a time. Most organizations, I think, shy away from that today, first of all, because it's very expensive, and secondly, because there's such a high level of professionalism within many organizations that they don't need what is called resident counsel. And sometimes they don't even need what is a full-time campaign consultant. But one area that I think is really important to have the consultant do, and that's the planning study, because it's really hard for you to go out and talk to people in your community and ask them the kind of questions that a consultant will ask. And it's also very difficult for someone who's not experienced in this area to actually evaluate the results of the questions that they do ask to the community members. So I would suggest that if your budget is limited, that you look first at engaging a consultant to do the planning study, and then from there maybe have them do the campaign plan, because I find that lots of organizations can implement a plan, but they just don't know how to develop the plan in the first place. And if you hire a consultant to do the plan, they'll lay out the job descriptions for your volunteers, the timeline, the budget, and basically have the whole thing in place. And then you can just follow up with, maybe you just need a consultant to do some selected things like volunteer training or writing your case for support, or maybe you need somebody to come in once a month for a day or two, or maybe you need someone to do selected things like research. So determine what your skills are internally and where you need a fundraising consultant, and then engage the right person for the right job. Don't hire, I once had a client who hired a grant writer to run an entire campaign, and this gentleman was probably a very good grant writer, but he wasn't experienced at all in campaigns. So make sure that when you're hiring someone, you know what it is you need them to do, and then hire the right person for the job. And some of the things like, I think Susan can probably talk more about hiring a consultant maybe just to help with things like grant proposal. Maybe if you've never done a capital grant, maybe you want to hire someone just to do that. I know years ago there used to be people who did nothing but Kresge grants, and so those are some things that I think you need to look at what your organization needs and then go from there. So Susan, you may have some things to add to that.
Largely, I agree. I think in all of these bulleted items on this slide, your organization is really looking to, number one, to see where it really needs expertise that it doesn't currently have, and number two, where, given potentially limited budget dollars, does it feel like it can spend that money. Of course, as with everything, sometimes you need to invest in infrastructure to have a robust outcome. But I've done everything from, I tend to do writing for campaigns, and so from writing the case statement to writing proposals, or even just helping organizations define their approach to funders. So that's a pretty outside kind of perspective compared to the in-house kind of campaign that Linda talked about. But in essence, it's certainly worthwhile thinking about what your needs are, because the staffing side can get really tricky during a campaign. There can be so much to do that sometimes it just helps to have a one-off person that you can call when a big grant comes around and you need a few more hands on deck. So at any rate, we can take questions on this, but we want to leave a few more minutes in case there are additional questions. And as you're queuing them up, we'll let you know that Linda has 2 terrific books on capital campaigns and has a code for them. I think it looks like they're dated, Linda, from the time we were originally supposed to conduct this, but I'm sure she'll fix that. And in the meantime, it looks like there was a question too. Oh, and I should say, Linda and I also, for those of you who are aspiring consultants, also have included the consulting book that we worked on with a number of terrific consultants, for those of you who are thinking of pursuing that as a career. I want to make sure that we get to Cecilia's question about, she asked, in discussing focused research, does that include requesting sit-downs with foundations that may do so, or mailing information without an ask yet informing them? It's a good question, and I would say that certainly if you can get a sit-down meeting, more power to you. But in my experience with capital campaigns, foundations usually want to meet at a point where you are ready to ask for funding. Again, if it's a funder that has worked with your organization for a long time, they may be more willing to sit down and talk to you about it. That's for sure. If it's a prospect, they may be a little less likely to meet if they know if it's a capital campaign, because again, other than a very small selection of foundations, most of them don't prioritize capital campaigns at this point. So they really, in a way, the later you go to them, the better, when you have all of your ducks in order. But you can certainly just try to ask them, even by phone, whether this is an interest area and whether they would look at a letter of intent from you. Linda, do you have anything else to add from your experience?
No, I think that's my experience too. Some foundations will sit down with you, others they just send us the proposal. Mm-hmm.
Sarah asked a tough question about why this trend in foundations moving away from capital campaigns, and might this trend reverse? This is obviously speculation on my part, but I think a lot of them are moving away from capital campaigns because there recently has been a shift toward this ROI, the return on investment, and can you show that there's a real return on investment when you're putting money into a building? And is a building even the best place for a foundation to park its money to show that it's doing good in the world? So that is my read on it. And will that trend reverse itself? I'm pretty optimistic that this ROI piece is going to run its course, as most other trends do in the foundation funding world. The question is, will the money go back into campaigns at that point? It's really hard to say. I think that the best insurance when you want to know that you're going to get funding out of foundations, particularly during campaigns, is just to have terrific relationships with them beforehand. Because if they know that you're doing good work up until the campaign begins, then they're only more likely to get excited about the fact that you're looking to grow and establish more sustainability within the community. But of course, they want to know that you've done all the background work as well. There are plenty of organizations that unfortunately have gone under post-recession because they didn't follow the advice that Linda gave earlier, which is that they didn't plan for the idea that they would have operating expenses post-campaign. Linda, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I think that's a great answer. I just wanted to mention, though, while we have this slide up, that yes, we originally had this webinar scheduled for June, so obviously you don't need to order by June 13th. Since today is July 24th, we will give you till July 26th to get that 15% discount. And I also wanted to just show you our websites, because you can feel free to contact Susan or I either through our websites or directly through our email, which is linda@lindalizakowski.com. And I believe yours is Susan@resourcepartnersonline.com, right, Susan?
Correct.
So if you wanted to get in touch with us, because sometimes you think of questions after you go back to talk to the rest of your staff members or board members, you might think of additional questions. So feel free to email either one of us after the fact, and we're happy to answer those questions. And we also want to wish you all good luck on your campaigns.
That's it. Thanks so much for participating.
Thank you, ladies. What a wonderful webinar, as always. We're so honored to have both of you present multiple webinars for us throughout the year. And we appreciate everybody else for attending. And that concludes our webinar. We'd like to ask each of you to remain with us a few moments longer and complete the short survey that you see on the screen. Take a moment to evaluate the webinar, the presenters, and everything else, and provide GPA with topics for all of our future webinars. We do take all of your recommendations into consideration, and sometime in the fall, that's when we'll be designing the new schedule for the upcoming year. Linda and Susan, we'd like to thank you both for your time and willingness to share all of your information. Thanks to all who have attended. We're glad that you can join us, and we hope that this session was wonderful and helpful for you. Later today, you all will receive the recorded version of this webinar. And just as a reminder, all active GPA members do receive the entire catalog of recorded and live webinars with your membership. So please take a moment and visit the GPA calendar for upcoming webinars, as well as the GPA on-demand page on the website. Just a little bit of a news for all of you. We are getting a brand new website come August 29th. So this is very exciting for us, and so everything will be updated and easier to navigate for all of you. So stay tuned for news on that. Again, thank you all, and have a wonderful day.
Bye.
Bye.